Alrighty, hi everybody. So today we're going to be talking about subcultures. And the subculture that I'm focusing on today is the country club plaza. I feel like to be able to properly discuss and identify my subject today, I'd like to define the term culture. Culture is defined as the arts and other manifestations of human intellectual achievement regarded collectively, according to the Oxford Dictionary, of course. Culture is an aspect of humanity that has been observed and documented for many years, and as a result has allowed for the creation of subcultures. Haimfler informs us that a subculture is a relatively diffuse social networking shared identity that has distinctive meanings and certain ideas, practices, and objects, and a sense of marginalization from or resistance to a perceived conventional society. That's a little bit of a wordy definition right there. With that being said, I'd like to begin the adventure into the past and present culture as well as the present subculture of the Country Club Plaza, which is an outdoor shopping mall that sits approximately 1 mile from UMKC. This is an area of Kansas City with a rich history that is great for examining the broad and narrow aspects of cultures and subcultures. So let's venture into the term culture a bit more. The term culture refers to a very broad definition of examining the stages of humanity. Culture is all encompassing and allows us to see humanity from an intellectual standpoint in a more compact and all around view. So when we think of the word culture, we tend to think of small or large groups of gatherings of like minded people. These people typically spend time together, discussing their beliefs, and eventually find a way to unify themselves to outwardly create concrete expressions of these beliefs. These expressions are sometimes very easy to identify, such as church buildings or organizations, but they can also be subtle expressions, like meetings with small numbers of people or wearing propaganda that supports the mission of the group, like t-shirts and hats and sun visors and things of that nature. In an almost chronological order, though, subcultures are formed within cultures. Subcultures tend to be harder to identify as they typically are smaller in volume. Subcultures and cultures share a lot of characteristics, such as consistently being identified by cultural traditions, cuisines, religious practices, and race or ethnicity. However, subcultures tend to be a microcosm of these traditions and practices. So, within the microcosm, you can expect to find a variance of changes that can include groups of people who aim to show defiance against the overwhelming culture. So members of each of these subcultures share a common identity, food tradition, dialect, or language, and other cultural traits that come from their common ancestral background or experience. Says Dennis O'Neill, who wrote an article called What is Culture? And this is found on the internet. Although subculture and culture has a focus around cultural identity, experience and intellectual identity are very large parts of how subcultures are made, and today that's going to be my focus. So, touching back on the plaza a little bit, Kansas City is currently a bustling hub of business and diversity. I'm currently employed at the Country Club Plaza as a sales lead manager at Express. Diversity is something that I see on a daily basis as Express has a large clientele that spans the spectrum. However, it's not a large group of diversity. I do want to point that out because later I'll be talking about how diversity is something that was, just recently accepted and how it's still a very small portion of what we see on the plaza. The plaza was not always open and accepting of diversity. In fact, the roots of the plaza stem from one thing that most of us have either heard of or experienced at least once in our lifetime, and that's racism. The plaza was built in 1922 by the founder, J.C. Nichols. And J.C. Nichols belonged to a culture that prevailed until it was forced to conform to lawful standards. This is the culture of racism. During the 1800s and early mid 1900s, racism was an idea that most people shared and practiced openly and confidently. So, how does the plaza perpetuate a culture of racism that prevailed in history and has now become a smaller subculture of ideas? So, let's dive deeper into the history of Kansas City and see what implications that we find to better understand the structure of the plaza and the surrounding areas. So, a few blocks over from the plaza is what we call the Truce Dividing Line. So, if you come out of UMKC and you go towards Rockhurst and towards the clinic, our UMKC clinic, you're going to eventually hit that Truce Dividing Line. And historically and currently speaking, Truce is a street that represents the divide between decent areas like the plaza and UMKC Rockhurst and rundown areas that are just east of that line. There were many tactics that were used to create the Truce Dividing Line, including redlining, blockbusting, restrictive covenants, and using panic to influence whites to make a decision to sell their homes out of fear of ethnic minorities ruining the property values and the area. These tactics all represent different branches of urban studies, and I'd just like to briefly expound on those. So, according to Introduction to Cities, How Place and Space Shape Human Experience, which was my urban studies book, redlining is a systematic denial of mortgages and other forms of lending in minority communities, says Chin, Oram, and Paulson, the authors of the book. Redlining is a major reason why areas like the Truce Dividing Line exist. These areas are prime examples of how minority communities were financially discriminated against, therefore creating majority white areas where mortgages were approved, and creating minority areas where mortgages were denied. So according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, blockbusting is profiteering by inducing property owners to sell hastily and often at a loss by appeals to fears of depressed values because of the threatened minority encroachment and then reselling at inflated prices. Restrictive covenants were mortgages and contracts that specifically stated that whites were only welcome to take advantage of mortgages and funding available in that area. These types of ideas stem from racism, which was the culture that prevailed during that time period. Currently, we're still dealing with racism at some capacity, but in a smaller proportion that I believe is more of a subculture now than the overruling belief and culture in our modern times. This is what makes the plaza and the Truce Dividing Line excellent examples of how culture is subject to change over time, whether subcultures spring into cultures or cultures downgrade and downsize to subcultures. With the inclusion of UMKC Rockhurst near the plaza, there has been an uptick in diversity and a downward spiral of the now racist subculture. These areas are still predominantly white, but we do have a very minute percentage of ethnic diversity. And speaking from my experience as an employee on the plaza, diversity is something that could be greatly improved upon. However, the experiences that my associates and coworkers have experienced seem to be a little different from mine. So to accurately capture the experience of the plaza through the eyes of the associates, I interviewed my store manager, my co-store manager, and one of my sales associates. And they're all between the ages of 18 and 32. So these associates have worked on the plaza from 6 months to 7 years. And the first question that I asked them was if they were familiar with the terms redlining, blockbusting, or gentrification. And each associate said no. I was a little surprised, but the associates also said that they didn't know the history of the plaza or who built it. And interestingly enough, the associates also said that they did not have a general understanding of what subculture might be. When I did ask the associates what they thought redlining might be, I got some pretty interesting answers. One of them was that they thought that redlining was marking down the original ticket price to a discounted clearance price. So that might give you a little idea of how disconnected the associates were from the topic that I was speaking on, but also how connected they were to their jobs, and it really kind of puts into perspective what the plaza means to them. So this alluded me to the fact that their ignorance of the history and legacy allowed them to perform with an unbiased attitude towards all races and ethnicities, and I feel like that's very important. When informed of the history, as well as the definitions of the terms that I asked them about, and after I asked them to give me an opinion on it, I did gain a little bit of useful insight on how they feel about the plaza. So, the sales associate, Abby, who's 18 years old, stated that racism hasn't been a big deal. Quote, the Trump presidency has caused racism to flare up, but until now, it hasn't been a problem. I believe that there is an equal amount of white and black citizens that spend their time on the plaza. Heather, my 32-year-old store manager, stated that, quote, history doesn't have a direct correlation to present matters because people are typically ignorant of the history of the area. Heather says that she understood why the plaza was built and that during the time of construction, it bore no negative effect on society because the racist culture was overwhelmingly popular. She believes that now, in this time and age, she can see the negative connotations of building such a place centered around that culture, but she sees it as a necessary evil for the accumulation of wealth, which is a very interesting standpoint. Christina, who is my 26-year-old co-store manager, says that now that she's aware of the negativity that surrounds the founding of the plaza, she believes that it should be renamed and refounded in a more positive light. I believe that the plaza subculture is still mired in the past, definitely. Some people are aware of its past and present, but yet they see it as an insignificant part of the plaza's operation, and some even see it in a completely opposite light. However, we seem to all agree that now the racist culture has taken a downward spiral into smaller subcultures. But nonetheless, those subcultures are still thriving in some areas. Being able to recognize the change over time does grant a glimmer of hope for continued change in this area that was designed with entertainment, shopping, and dining in mind. Thank you.